Let me, if I can, lay out this particular complexity we're in now, this trade war between US and China. Now, you're not an economist.
Mhm.
In fact, so you think deeply about history of peoples and history of China. You think about culture, you think about protests and the movements and so on. And there's some degree to which this trade war is less about the economics. Now that layer is also very important, and we could discuss it. But there's also a deeply cultural standoff almost happening here, which would be interesting. So in April, as people know, Trump escalated a trade war with China using tariffs, raising them on Chinese imports to 145%. Xi Jinping then responded by raising tariffs on US goods to 125% and suspending exports on certain rare earth minerals and magnets to the US. The Chinese government also indicated it would limit the import of Hollywood films and restricted certain American companies from operating in China. Now, after that, Xi Jinping broke silence on April 11th and again on April 14th, and since, basically saying that China is not backing down, and positioned himself and China as the, quote, responsible superpower that promotes, as you were saying, that promotes sort of the reasonable multilateral global trading framework and a stable global supply chain. He said, quote, for over 70 years, China's progress has been built on self-reliance and hard work, never on handouts from others, and it remains unafraid of any unjust oppression. Also, he said, there are no winners in a trade war, and going against the world will only lead to self-isolation. This was all said as part of a tour of Southeast Asia, and he was calling on China and the European Union to defend international rules opposing, quote, unilateral bullying. At the same time, I saw that China is escalating internal propaganda, including, interestingly, it would be nice to talk to you about it, the use of the Mao Zedong 1953 speech during the Korean War, where he says, we will never yield. My question is, with this standoff, who do you think will blink first? Where does this go?
So I think one persistent there's a lot to unpack there for of a historian too. I mean, I think that the reference to being bullied by a foreign power is something that comes up periodically and plays to this kind of notion of the 100 years of national humiliation that's been talked about by generations now of Chinese leaders to talk about that period from the 1840s to the 1940s. There were a group of foreign powers who were involved in bullying China in one way or another, and you can selectively pick one or another. So there is a way in which this can be, and if Xi Jinping gives that kind of speech in Southeast Asia, he's speaking to a place where there is knowledge of times of the past when the United States was a aggressive force there. It's also a part of the world where there have been times when China has been that. So there is a way of positioning vis-a-vis other parts of the world that is crucial part of this. That I guess it's I'm circling around it, but there's a tendency in discussions of U.S.-China relations to think about it in terms of a bilateral discussion or dispute, even though time and again we realize that places other than the United States are key variables in these things. So the US and China being at odds in the Mao era, what changed things dramatically for that wasn't so much even a change in I mean, yes, Nixon was the one who went to China, but what made it possible for Nixon to go to China was that the Sino-Soviet split happened. That actually it was tensions between China and the Soviet Union that altered equations for the United States and China. And I happened to be in China in 1999 when NATO bombs hit the Chinese embassy in Belgrade and 3 Chinese citizens died. And there was tremendous discontent about that, anger about that within China. And there were some rare protests that the government allowed to happen, but students were worked up about it and there were protests outside the American embassy and the British embassy. And that happened, and then in 2001, there was a spy plane incident that happened, and so there was a lot of discussion that the next decade was going to see US-China tensions being the major force in the world. 9/11 happened. It was a dramatic reset for the trajectory that the US and China were on, which is these are two totally different things, the Sino-Soviet split and 9/11. But in both cases, no matter how careful you were at parsing what was likely to be the next 5 years for US-China relations, get dramatically changed by something that happened that wasn't the US and China. And in the current situation, the trade war, I know that it will be very important that China can try to increase sales of consumer products to Europe. This is something, and that Europe's view about the United States is changing right now. These are all kinds of variables that are outside of simply Washington and Beijing as being the two actors. And sometimes Beijing can't control what's happening outside, and sometimes Washington can't. And so I guess this is simply saying that when you're trying to keep the eye on the ball, it matters a lot what India's relationship to China and the United States is. So all of these are happening there. So I think that's it. That it's both tremendously important what's going on between China and the United States, but it's important to remember that they're not the only players uh, in this dynamic.
Also, on top of this, how much cultural will is there to sort of not surrender to bullying? How much of that is there? So, like you said, the century of humiliation, both for Xi Jinping and the Chinese populace, like willingness to go through some short-term pain to not be humiliated.
The story that's been intensively told about the past is something that provides the possibility for this to matter a lot. That it's something that's just so it's so much a part of the legitimating story of the Chinese Communist Party. And then you have to look at, are there things that are happening that aid the Chinese Communist Party's story? So the rise of what can seem like or is anti-Chinese sentiment within the United States can feed that propaganda story. And so certainly, during COVID, there was a way that if you're the Chinese Communist Party and you're saying we get a disproportionate amount of blame for whatever happens in the world, then if there were things you could point to in the foreign media or from foreign governments, then that helps you. So I think, there is a setup here where certainly for Xi Jinping, I think the desire to not be seen weak is crucial.
Sometimes I wonder how much of these leaders operate on pure ego, because politically and on a human level, they don't want to come off as losers in a standoff versus coming to a economic win-win for both nations. And I worry that there is a real pride here, that the century of humiliation has deeply saturated the populace, the Communist Party, this idea where they're just not going to back down. And that, I think, will cause tremendous pain in the short term for the United States, I think for China and the world, because it completely transforms the supply chain of everything. There is a global nature, there is a multilateral nature of all the economic partnerships that are formed throughout the 21st century. And this kind of protectionist, nationalistic kind of ideology goes in the face of all of that. And it's going to create a huge amount of pain, like for regular Americans. But also, I worry that this increases, not decreases, the chance of a global war or conflict of different kinds. Do you see a hopeful possibility for resolution? for de-escalation here.
It's a hard time to figure out what you can to sort of hopeful angles. I mean, I guess what's hard to even balance these things out. So one of the things that I've thought about when you talk about rising chances of war, that often Taiwan comes to mind with China. And one of the things that I've thought of is that for Xi Jinping, that military action against Taiwan would be increased by um, a sense of desperation, a sense of losing popularity, or a sense of not having a good story to tell about why he and the party deserves to lead. So then there's a kind of way of playing to the national sentiments of some part of the population. So then, in a sense, it's hopeful that I think in some ways right now, Xi Jinping is not looking desperate in the eyes of the world. You know, if he can focus on potentially being seen more positively in other parts of the world by seeming like a kind of force for stability, seen as somebody who's supporting rather than challenging some elements of the global order, that might lessen the chances of a rash action toward Taiwan that would be a kind of desperation move.
The complicated thing here is that if he gives in, he can come off as the responsible person who cares about the world, or he can come off weak. If he doesn't give in and even escalates the tariffs, although I think he said no more escalation on the China front, then he comes off strong, but also the equally unreasonable person who doesn't care about the world, who only cares about his own ego and maybe some aspect of the Communist Party maintaining power. Because just like with Tiananmen Square and the Tank Man, you don't know once you make the decision how the world will read that decision, what kind of things will become viral memes about the telling of that story. And of course, in part, I think Donald Trump's reach is much wider because he's constantly out there. And I think there's a more reserved, less messaging out of Beijing. So it's a really chaotic environment in which to make strong decisions.